So welcome back to the Financial Bites podcast. I'm your host, Chris Passmore, your social media CPA. Recently, I read something really interesting. A survey by Statista stated that the number of new businesses has gone from 560,000 in 2010 to 840,000 in 2021, or a 50% increase. And that's why I'm so excited to introduce my guest, Janice Miller, to discuss the essentials of a new business and just to share some of the accolades that Janice has received. If you look her up, you'll see that she's a super lawyer. She was spotlighted by the Los Angeles Business Journal as a Women of Influence, top women lawyer and legal visionary. So Janice, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Chris. It's amazing to be here. Congratulations on such a successful podcast.
Thank you so much. So we're going to talk today about some essentials for a new business owner and what tips we can share with them. But before we get into that, tell us, our audience, a little bit more about you and your background. How did you end up as the managing partner of your own firm and your career journey?
Thanks, Chris. Appreciate that and glad to share. So I was born and raised in Philadelphia and knew at a young age that I wanted to be a journalist, having nothing to do with the law, and went to school for mass communications and did my undergraduate degree in 3 years. Went to law school at night, and one of the last classes I had to take was the law of mass communications, and fell in love with law. So I moved myself out here to California, where I worked for both Disney and Universal Studios for the majority of my career. Prior to that, I dabbled in litigation. I was a baby litigator and knew that that's absolutely something I didn't want to do. I wanted to make love, transactional law, not war, litigation. And then after a number of years at Universal, 18, 19 or so, left there, and here we go. About 8 years ago, started my firm. It's been called a couple different things, but right now we're Miller Haga Law Group. We're business transactional lawyers, doing everything corporate transactional and some real estate and leasing as well.
Okay. And if I'm not mistaken, when I was reading your bio, during your tenure at Universal, you had a pretty big accomplishment that maybe you want to share with the audience. A certain area was built out in Southern California. Do you want to share a little bit about that one? I'm always excited about this.
Love to, Chris. And it's very exciting. My time at Universal was spent both in the theme park and on City Walk. And one of the major things that I spent about 8 years working on was bringing the Wizarding World of Harry Potter, in part with a team of many other professionals, to the Hill, to Universal Studios. So that's shared both in Orlando and here in LA and in a lot of the other parks as well.
Yeah. Well, so just to share, and I'm not making this up, my daughter was literally at Harry Potter World yesterday as part of Universal. So you get accolades from the Passmore family. So just to share, she had a wonderful time yesterday.
That's great.
And so what types of clients are you primarily helping right now through Miller Haga?
Well, it's pretty diverse. We say we're industry agnostic, which means that we support any type of businesses from startup, if they're funded, right, all the way through the wind down or an ending event. And people say, well, what does that all entail? Well, it entails a lot of stuff. When somebody is starting a business, you have to ask, number one, why and where, right? I'm a journalist, as we mentioned. So who, what, why, where, when, and how, right? Let's get the fundamentals of the story and put that together and write the correct corporate form in the correct location for any business. So we take that through the startup process of a business, raising capital, getting everything together, all the way through the transactional life cycle of the business. So during operations, we can help them with contracts. As they get further mature, if they need to bring on money, we can help them raise money or do other types of financing. When they get mature and they're ready to sell or merge or close down, we can help them as well. So that's called business transactional law. And like I said, part and parcel of that is we dabble in employment law, but have employment law resources that we go to. We do real estate and leasing, financing, and think of it this way, Chris, for you and your audience. If it can be reduced down to writing and you need to put it on paper, that's when you give us a call.
Okay. And so I'm really excited with your experience with startups, because that kind of leads into our discussion of what documents are really necessary when forming in a business. And just before we started recording, I was doing some Google searching, and there's always lists. Everyone has a list. And one thing that I see coming up time and time again saying, be careful of this, is described as a poorly drafted operating agreement. So what's your advice here? What is a new business owner, a new young entrepreneur has this great idea for an e-commerce company? I mean, what do they need to know to form their business, and maybe some of the pitfalls you've seen through your clients?
Really great questions. And it's not a short answer. No one business fits any one company. There are different models and different types of businesses that can be formed, but you really need to understand what the company is trying to achieve at the outset. And then I always ask my clients fundamentally, what's your goal? What's your end game? And we try to help you get there. So to answer some of your questions, in California, the two major types of businesses, although there are many others, but the two major types of businesses in California are corporations, and that can be an S corporation, which means it's closely held, small business. Tax implications flow through to the owners, but I'll let you handle. I'll handle that as the social media CPA, or what you mentioned before, an LLC or a limited liability company, where an operating agreement would come in. And the partners or whomever is, if it's more than one person that's involved with the company, the partners need to sit down and form this operating agreement as well as a buy-sell agreement to set out the roadmap of who's going to do what. Again, who, what, why, where, when, and how the company's going to operate, what the goals of the company are, how many employees they're going to have, are they a service organization, or are they making widgets, and how they're going to achieve those goals. Companies need a plethora of trusted advisors. They need a CPA like yourself. They need a good lawyer. They need somebody in insurance, somebody in banking, and many other disciplines to help them through the operational life cycle of their business.
Okay, so we talked about a well-crafted operating agreement, depending on the entity, or if you're a corporation, maybe that's your articles of incorporation or your bylaws that give the kind of the general guidelines for how the company operates. And you mentioned at the beginning how important it is to assess the entity type. And I was reading something that said a lot of new startups go the sole proprietor route. And there's some huge liability or risk that comes with that. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because when I was reading about that, I was floored that people might not realize the personal exposure they have if they go that route.
Sure. So when someone starts a company, one of the reasons, there are a couple of reasons for starting a company. Number one is a liability reason, an avoidance of liability, de-risking the situation, which as a lawyer, I want to handle. The second is what you handle, which is the tax implications. When you have a sole proprietor coming in and starting a company, the sole proprietor has to ask those couple of questions: what they're doing, and from a tax perspective, what's the best vehicle to do that? The liability potentially comes in if the sole proprietor doesn't establish corporate governance and they don't have a separate bank account if they were to commingle funds. They don't have insurance. The liability of what they're doing, say it's a product that they're developing, you don't have correct insurance and there's a product liability issue, that could be catastrophic to that person. So you want to make sure as a sole proprietor that you're lining up all your ducks, so to speak, to make sure that you keep yourself separate from your company and that there's a distinction between the two.
So I have to ask, do you have any horror stories of you were introduced to a potential client and they happen to be set up in a way that they were overly exposed? Or have you heard any, great anecdotes? Because I imagine someone has a great business idea. They throw up a website, the easiest thing is the sole proprietorship. Then something bad happens, a trip and fall. Have you got any stories? Have you heard anything like this where you kind of just shake your head going, oh my God, if only this person knew?
Well, I've heard other stories when it comes to buy-sell agreements, and we can talk about that in a minute. If I'm helping somebody set up a company, or if they come to me after the fact, we try to correct that real quick. But for the reasons that we've described, you're right. There are other liabilities if you just set up a website and don't have the correct things. ADA lawsuits from a website perspective are a very, very big potential liability right now. And I don't want to call some other lawyers bottom feeders, but there are some lawyers out there that go after websites that are not ADA compliant. They don't have the right website privacy policy terms and conditions or an ADA accessibility statement. So again, when you're starting a business, you need to have that team of folks that understand. If you don't understand, we all need assistance. And as a small proprietor or somebody just starting out, having a brain trust that you can go to and use as resources is the best way to avoid liability in the long run.
Yeah. And so you mentioned a buy-sell agreement, and I've heard that from time to time. And I think every good service provider always looks for that with their clients, but tell our audience a little bit more about that. What exactly is a buy-sell agreement? Who needs it? When do you need it? And then let's get into some of those horror stories of, oh, this really bad thing happened because maybe they didn't have one.
Yeah, happy to do that. So a buy-sell agreement, as it sounds, is an agreement that parties to a company, whether they're shareholders or whether they're members of an LLC, would form. I highly recommend at the beginning of the relationship. You have to look at a buy-sell agreement, Chris, like it's a premarital agreement. You're about to get married to this person. And again, from a communications perspective, it sets out the who, where, why, when, and how. We call it the 4 Ds: death, disability, divorce, dissolution. What happens to your company if you have a partner and your partner becomes disabled, or God forbid your partner passes away? How is the company going to run? And if the partnership was a 50-50 partnership, what happens to that partner's percentage of ownership in the company, whether it's an LLC or whether it's a corporation? Horror story? We have a company that we represent for a long period of time, 4 partners ranging in age from 50 to 72. Now, one would think that it would be the 72-year-old that something would happen to. But sadly, in this particular instance, it was the 50-year-old that had a stroke. He's fine. Yeah. He's recovering. But there was no buy-sell agreement. And it took us about 9 months to negotiate an out for this partner because there was no roadmap. The buy-sell agreement provides the roadmap as to what happens in these, what we call triggering events, the death, the disability, which is what happened in this case. So when should a buy-sell agreement be entered into? We scream to the top of our lungs at the time the business is started. Now, you might say, well, I'm just starting my business. I don't have extra money for lawyers. And my response would be, please don't start your business then until you do. In order to be a company, a valid company in the state of California, you have to have what's called sufficient capital to start your business. And that capital can be very small. It could be what it takes to get the business formed and set up. And it could be your buy-sell agreement, your insurance, and then if you have employees, to get them covered in a certain way.
So let's think about that for a second. So if you have a group of 4 partners and something bad happens to one of them, heart attack, you name it, and that partner owns a percentage of the company, does that just go to the spouse then? And then without a buy-sell, then and now all of a sudden the spouse is the partner, or she can sell it to anybody she wants? Is that possible without a buy-sell?
Well, one of my favorite questions, or one of my favorite answers to questions, is it depends. So it depends what the parties have said or not said, right? In a legal situation, if it was a legal partnership, unless the spouse is a lawyer, they couldn't come into that. So that's one time, one really good way in buy-sell agreements is to get insurance. It's called key person insurance. And you use the key person insurance to, I'll call it, bond around any bad stuff that happens. Mm-hmm. In your instance, it might very well, if the person was married or has a partner and has a significant other, and that person dies with a will or without a will. Again, it depends on that situation, how that person's interest in the company would pass. Now, I can say, I know you're a partner in a big accounting firm, right? And you have certain parameters as part of the partnership that you're involved with. But I know your spouse is not an accountant. she wouldn't be entitled, I don't think, to come into your partnership. I think per your partnership agreement, and as partnership agreement should go, the company should be able to buy back first at a fair market value to be established now, hopefully, or later, based on certain parameters and algorithms, what your ownership interest would be.
Well, that seems to be so important. I mean, unless, and I'm talking about Facebook or Google or a publicly traded company, but if you have a privately held company, I mean, you really want to clearly define where your ownership will go in the case of something bad happening. I mean,
yeah,
you
sure.
wouldn't, I mean, that seems so important. So I just anecdotally, when you work with a new business, do they just think, of course I need that? Or is this all new to them and this is unexpected? And after you explain it, they go, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But it just seems like this probably doesn't come to a lot of people's minds when they first start their business.
You know, it really depends on where that particular group of folks starting the business are. Are they just starting out, or have they had some business? Have they been in the world of business and understand what a buy-sell agreement does and the protections that it affords the people that are covered under the buy-sell agreement? And it's not just the owners. Obviously, it's the owners' families, right? So again, it all depends on the level of sophistication of the folks. But if they don't know and they're just starting out in business, that's what we're here to do. Is we're here to help them out and educate them as to, again, not only the form of entity that they should be using, but whether or not a buy-sell agreement is appropriate and whether it's appropriate now or sometime later.
Okay. And to your point, just like with any, you know, you compare it to a prenuptial arrangement, you want to discuss this when things are good. And you really want to avoid negotiating a buy-sell agreement when things are bad or there's an emergency or a trauma. It just seems to make a whole lot of sense to do that at the beginning when everyone's healthy, happy, and not to deal with that when you also have something difficult happening. So that, I guess that's the advice, to do it early when everything's good. So that way, when something does happen, you've got a roadmap to follow.
100%, Chris. That's 100%. And remember, buy-sells aren't just when bad things happen. Buy-sells could be, I've decided that after being in this business for X number of years, that I would like to leave this business and take any profit that has come out because of my hard work with me. So there's mechanisms in buy-sell agreements for buying out my shares or membership interest in the business as well.
Okay. And I guess that's why it's so essential for all businesses, because it's not only in case of the bad thing, but thinking one day, to your point, what's your goal? And I imagine most people don't want to, quote unquote, die at the desk. So this gives you a clear pathway to exit and monetize what you have built over your career.
Absolutely. It deals with exit strategies as well as what happens in case of these triggering events that we discussed.
Okay. So we've talked a lot about some really important things that people have to have. They need to think about the type of structure, legal entity. They need to consider their operating agreement, a buy-sell agreement. So we're going to pivot a little bit and not talk about the agreements themselves, but where and how entrepreneurs can get these agreements to start up their business. So I want to talk about, if you don't mind, maybe some of the pros and cons of using one of the online services that are so prevalent these days. And I know the tagline with these folks is easy and affordable.
Right.
My experience, not necessarily with online legal services, but sometimes you think things are too good to be true. So what are your thoughts in that world? Because I won't give comment. I'm just curious. So what do you think? What do you think of that as an option, to go online, download an operating agreement and say, I'm good?
Yeah, don't do it. Because what happens a lot, and we do have war stories with formations, is that they're done incorrectly. Are they affordable? Sure. Are they easy? Absolutely. But they're not always 100% correct or the right vehicle for a business. I have a number of years, 25 plus years experience in doing this. So am I a little more expensive? Yeah, absolutely. But if you have questions, it's me. It's not just a bot filling out a form for you. And with all due respect to the bots that have their time and place, they don't really know the particulars of your transaction or what you're doing. So I get pretty strong when somebody comes to me and says, well, this is X amount of dollars and you're X plus. And I said, well, is the differential between the X and the X plus so significant that it's going to impact your overall business? And if the answer is yes, I'm pretty blunt with them. And I say, then save up your money. Don't start your business right now. It's not worth it.
Yeah. And I would even suggest that the extra cost today is worth the costs you would avoid in the future. I mean, I would think that any of the things done right in the long run are the best investment for an entrepreneur, for a business owner, because I've personally seen it with some clients. They'll have a operating agreement, and it's literally a stock agreement where all the company names are just blanks, and you just write it in. And I just can't imagine that really being a good solution when you need it.
It's not. It has the bare bones, but nothing else. And if you're not a lawyer and I'm sure that all of these entrepreneurs are absolutely amazing at what they do, but they're not lawyers. And if they were, they wouldn't be using the stock forms. Yep. So again, the recommendation is they have a minor time and place, but they should not be used in 99% of the situations, in my opinion.
Okay. And just to share, that was my opinion going into this. I want to hear yours first. That I've seen too many of them where you read the agreement and then you know how the company operates and you go, you're not even, it's night and day here. You know, for example, your operating agreement says your year end is June 30th and your year end is actually December 31st or something else. And it just seems so wrought with, it doesn't meet the needs of the company. I guess I'll just leave it there. So I agree with you. And I think that sometimes the least expensive route is not always the best route.
100%. Couldn't agree more, Chris.
So it's actually always this time during the podcast, I like to mix things up a little bit. We've talked shop now for about 20 minutes. I like to flip the business card around and ask you to share something about you personally with the audience. It could be, you know, for me, I love to go bike riding. So I'm out there in the mountains on my mountain bike constantly. So can you share one back of the card thing with the audience about you, Janice Miller?
Absolutely. Football is my favorite season. And I am in my glory because this is week 5, both from a college perspective and from a professional perspective. Love the sport, love the strategy. My daughter's an athletic trainer, worked with the University of Utah football team, and just adore the sport.
Okay. So you've got your college favorite, which is your Utah. And what's your professional favorite?
You know, I'm born and raised in Philadelphia, so I'll say the Eagles, but living in Los Angeles, it has to be the Rams and the Chargers.
The Rams and the Chargers. Okay. Yeah, I get Rams doing well last year. We'll hope to see that they have a good year this year.
This past week, not so good.
Not so good. So avid football fan. So the fall time of year is one of your favorites.
Yes, sir.
All right. So if you had to share your top tip for a business owner related to the formation of the documents you have, what's your go-to tip? Your thing that, you know, if you take one thing away from this podcast, take that away because this will save you. This is the best for you. What's the one tip you would share with everybody out there?
Know what your goals are and make sure that you have a 1-year, 3-year, 5-year plan and an exit strategy, and know in your mind what you want to achieve with this business. And I know it's very difficult when you're starting a business to say, oh, I want to know where I'm at 10 years from now or 15 years from now. But you have to lay the foundation for that business and establish it correctly. And if you lay that foundation and have a roadmap to get there, both from a tax perspective, from a liability perspective, you'll be much better off.
Okay. And so if any of our listeners want to reach out to you, ask for advice, potentially engage you for services, how can they find you?
Well, thanks, Chris. I appreciate that. There are many ways. The first is just my email address and our website. It's Miller, Miller, Haga, HAGA.com, or my email is jmiller@millerhaga.com. They can also find me on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram.
Okay. Well, Janice, thank you so much for being a guest on the Financial Bites podcast. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Chris. Appreciate it.